Thanks so much for having me. I'm still kind of perplexed that you think I have anything worth listening to say, but I will try to make it worth your while. So as Diane mentioned, I'm the Northside reporter for my station. We've got 3 community bureaus in the city of Chicago: Northside, Westside, and Southside. And the purpose for this was to really get close to the different communities that live in Chicago. In the Northside Bureau, I'm not reporting about Wrigley Field renovations or the Cubs. I'm reporting on the very far north side, the immigrant communities that live up there, also more generally the socioeconomically challenged communities that live in Uptown, in Rogers Park, in Westridge, that whole swath there of the north side. So it's been an interesting job because certainly Chicago is the most diverse city that I've ever lived in, and I think that the Chicago experience really changes depending on what your income level is and what your background is, and so it's been very interesting to sort of cover a number of issues. So just to give you a sense of how I planned this, I'm going to sort of string together different stories that I've reported on that fall under different themes that I just seem to keep on running into, reporting not only in the city of Chicago, but I think if any of you are coming from the suburbs, we're seeing a lot of these issues play out in the suburbs as well. So when I came here 4 years ago, we were already very much in the throes of the bad economy, right? So 2010, work was still very difficult to come by. And it was an interesting time as well because I think what we've been seeing lately is changes in the immigrant makeup of the country. We have seen in recent years a lot of immigration from Mexico has kind of plateaued, but we have been seeing pretty rapid increases of other populations. And in particular from my office, which is on Devon Avenue in West Ridge. Are you guys familiar with Devon Avenue?
Yes.
Okay. So you must know it's really the heart of the Indo-Pakistani, South Asian business community. And one of my specialties, particularly with immigration, is to cover it as it relates to the Asian populations. And so, while we were seeing immigration kind of plateau from Mexico, we are continuing to see a significant increase of immigration from the Asian countries. And so it's been an interesting lens through which to view, the renewed discussion of immigration reform, because what may be good for one particular, to address one particular issue with immigration from one population may really adversely affect another population that gets less sort of coverage in the mainstream media, and I'll get more into that a little bit later. But this issue of who are our immigrants is an important one. So to give you an idea, one of the themes that keeps coming up in covering Asian Americans is the discomfort among some Asian Americans with what they call the myth of the model minority. This notion that all people, all Chinese people or all Indian people or all Pakistani people are engineers and doctors and they're doing just fine and they came here highly educated and we don't really have to worry about them. I think one of the interesting things that I learned when the 2010 census numbers came out, and this really surprised me, was if you look at the Pakistani community in the greater Chicago area, almost half of them live at a low income level. And the way that that's defined is earning up to 200% of the federal poverty line, which is significant. That's almost half, 47%. And so, to tell you the truth, I still haven't done a story about this because I haven't been able to find anyone who is willing to be the face of this story. I've talked to a number of people, but nobody really wants to be the face of this issue. And in trying to find people to talk to me about it, the first places I went to, of course, were sort of the social service type agencies up in the Devon area to find out if they could find anyone or if they knew anyone who might be willing to share what this experience is and how did it come to be. I didn't actually have much luck with that, and not only did I not have luck, but a lot of people were shocked. People who work every day with these communities were shocked at the statistic. So my next stop was mosques. Maybe they see people come. That's a first stop sometimes for new immigrants. And a lot of, so-called community leaders were also shocked at the statistics. So it's not just an issue of like, who are these immigrants? Do we really know who our immigrants are? Sometimes people within those immigrant communities who consider themselves to be working closely with that population, they may not. I'm getting like a security message here, so I'm just going to hit cancel. Okay. Sometimes they're not even familiar with it themselves, and they may be working every day with these populations. So I just want to share a clip that I got from an interview I did with a man named Ahmed Ansari. He works with the Islamic Circle of North America. That's a mosque that's located on California Ave, just a little bit south of Devon. And I went to him because, is anyone here familiar with the concept of zakat? No? Do you want to?
It's a gift for the poor, is it not? It's a contribution to those who may be needy.
Yeah, it's one of the pillars of Islam. And some people kind of compare it to tithing. It's like if you, especially if you're very well-to-do, there's an expectation that you will give charitably a certain amount of your wealth. And so many mosques will collect basically like a zakat fund. And if anyone in the community needs, financial help, then they can kind of like apply for assistance. So this man, Ahmed Ansari, is sort of in the committee of ICNA that helps to determine, where zakat goes. And I was like, look, have you been seeing a disproportionate rise in the number of Pakistani people in your mosque who are asking for money? And this is what he told me.
Although it used to be the people from Pakistan means that very educated people, engineers, doctors, and those kind of people. Now it's not that way. It's changing, and it's changing on daily basis. More of the people who has no education, who has no way of living, like less rich people also coming here. Those who cannot afford to come here, they find whatever the way they can find to come here and start living here.
So I think, what he was getting at is what we're seeing now is like a lot of people that came, a lot of the people that are coming now are people that, aren't coming for their education. They're not coming to be part of like a graduate school program like maybe a lot more people were doing 30 years ago. And it's very difficult to get a handle on how to help folks like this if they're not very forthcoming about their existence, right? So I hope someday I'll be able to find someone who's willing to share their story so we can put that out there. One of the related issues is this issue of education and English proficiency, which has been also an issue if you look at the refugee population. One of the interesting things about what we're seeing in the refugee population in the U.S. as a whole, and certainly we're seeing it in Chicago, is that, before, basically, we started getting refugees in the 70s, and the first major wave was from Vietnam. And then we started having some from Russia and some from Cuba. Is anyone seeing a theme here? These are countries... Yeah, these were like basically Cold War countries, right? Countries where we were offering kind of like a political refuge in the United States. More recently, in the last, 10 or 15 years, the U.S. really has changed the way that it's thought about who it's going to extend refugee status to. And it's much more based on like true need, human need, people who are displaced from their home country because of war or conflict or some other sort of severe situation. And what that's resulted in is we're seeing a lot more diversity in the countries from which refugees are coming. And many of them may be coming from countries where they didn't have access to English classes, you know, and so we're dealing with a much more diverse population and a much more a population that needs support in many more varieties of ways than what we used to see. And this is a real challenge, I think, for the social service agencies that are increasingly asked to step in and try to bolster what there is no longer federal funding for or state funding for. And so I want to see which clip is the good one to play for you here. Oh my God, Lauren, you've got like so many windows popping up on your computer. That's okay. So, you know, one of the issues has been housing for these refugees. In Chicago, traditionally, the uptown neighborhood has been the port of entry. Have any of you guys been to like Argyle Street? It's basically where the Vietnamese community first located when they came. Well, uptown is gentrifying. It is not easy to find affordable rents there anymore. And so then they started moving further north to Edgewater. That priced out. Now Rogers Park is getting expensive, and now they're moving more into West Rogers Park. And we're also starting to see more and more refugees locating to the suburbs directly. This has been a challenge for pretty much everybody involved, because the organizations like Refugee One, Heartland, those are the places that they need to really go to when they arrive. You know, they will set them up with ESL classes. They will set them up with, you know, they'll set up their first apartment for them. They'll help them with, you know, job skills. And they're conveniently located on the train, right? But that's not so convenient if you're living out in like some suburb somewhere, because the housing is cheaper. It's harder to get to the place that you need to go every day to start adjusting to life in the US. And so it's been a challenge for those suburbs as well. They're seeing in their school populations a lot more children who are coming with not at their grade level. They're also having some challenges communicating with their parents about just, you know, routine school notifications. I want to play a little bit of a clip of a fellow named Ryan Spangler, who is the housing coordinator for the Heartland Alliance for Human Needs and Human Rights. I had shadowed Ryan for a story I was doing about the changing population of refugees in the Chicago area. And he was literally setting up an apartment for a family of refugees that were coming from Nepal, like that night. And this is what he was telling me.
On the whole, it's basically you're guaranteed 3 months of rent, and then after that point, landlords are often like, well, what am I supposed to do if this person doesn't have a job yet? And that's a very hard question to answer, and all we can say is, you know, the agency's going to do our best to help them find a job, help them identify sources of income before the 3-month period is over. You know, but many landlords, you know, don't really want to have to fix someone after the 3 months, or have to deal with, you know, collecting rent after the 3 months when they can't, you know, when they don't have a job yet, or when they can't afford to pay it.
Okay, I don't know if you could hear that.
That, you know, just want to help and, like, you know, understand the situation, and willing to, you know, be flexible and tolerant and work with the agency.
Yeah, I don't know if you could hear that, but basically he was saying that, you know, these days, basically, federal funding to help with refugee resettlement lasts a refugee family about 3 months. And so they usually use that money to pay their rent every month, and then suddenly they're expected to like be working and pay their own rent after 3 months. And as you can imagine, you know, especially with the difficult economy that we've had in recent years, this has been this has been impossible for many families, especially considering that, again, it's a much more diverse group of refugees. Many of them don't have basic English language skills and can't look for a job with, you know, with no English proficiency. And so this is an issue that has kind of fallen on the backs of, organizations like Heartland Alliance. They have to work very closely with landlords to try to, postpone evictions of refugee families who they have a very difficult time adjusting to life here financially, much less culturally and everything else. But, another issue that's come up a lot in my reporting has been with immigrants who actually do come with a skill that there is a market for. I don't know how many of you guys have had the experience of like being in a cab with a cab driver who turns out to have like a PhD in engineering from some university or whatever. Like, this is such a common story. We all encounter it. One of the funny things that I was personally shocked to find out was that basically up until a few months ago, in the state of Illinois, the licensing exam for nail technicians was only offered in English and Spanish, not in Vietnamese. And like, that seems like such an obvious an obvious little change that could make it so much easier for a lot of immigrants to start legally, getting licensed. If they could take the exam in their own language, they can get a license and work legally and be productive members of society. I think one of the interesting things about that particular story is that the catalyst for translating the exam was not a Vietnamese person, it was a Chinese person who was like, I want this exam to be in Chinese, because she had a beauty school in Chinatown. She was having a lot of students who were basically, going through school, but then they weren't getting the license because they didn't know English well enough, and then they were working illegally. And so she was the one that sort of started saying, we need this in Chinese, and then other people were like, well, why don't you throw in Vietnamese as well? But I think one of the things that this highlights is that, like, some of the immigrant communities are just much better organized than others. In Chinatown, I would say in Chinatown, you have one of the most sophisticated organizing communities out there. They are very good at mobilizing behind their social service organizations, and they are getting increasingly sophisticated with their political lobbying and voter registration. The Vietnamese have a fairly substantial population in the greater Chicago area, but they're not really organized. And so when it comes to advocating for, the needs of their community, they just kind of aren't really there on it. What else? So there's another topic which I think actually Lauren is certainly the expert on it, about unaccompanied minors. This is something that I only learned about when I started reporting here. In the immigration debate, again, going back to that point that I made at the beginning about how immigration has plateaued in some cases from some countries, what has not plateaued is the number of children that are coming by themselves illegally. People under the age of 18 who may or may not have extended family in the US. They may be coming here to join family, or their family may be just sending them here to have some opportunities, earn some money, and send it back home. The number of unaccompanied minors coming to the US has really significantly risen in the last, 5 years, 6 years. Here's an example. When I reported, a story about it last year, they were on track to surpass, I believe, 26,000. And that's just the ones that are caught. Like, it's not even an indication of how many total are coming. This year, they've already blown through 60,000, you said? And the year is only like half over. This is a pretty significant issue, not just because, it's an immigration issue, but the surprising thing with the way that, when children are caught in the immigration system, they're not treated like other children in the justice system here. Children, if they get in trouble in the U.S., they are entitled to counsel. You know, they're given a lawyer. When you're a child and you're caught for illegal immigration, you are treated as an illegal immigrant. You are not entitled to a lawyer. And so you have some really bizarre situations where a very small child may be expected to represent him or herself in legal proceedings in immigration court, which, I mean, I don't even have to explain to you how crazy that is. I mean, it's just on its face. It just seems wrong and just bizarre. So I spoke with a couple of people who were themselves unaccompanied minors, and I don't remember which cut was which, so you'll have to bear with me.
I can go to the university.
You know, it's so quiet. Maybe I should just not do that.
You want to put the overhead on and we can use the overhead speakers?
Okay. I think we tried that earlier and it was not playing terribly well. That was hooked up to this. Should I try it?
Sure.
Okay.
I can go to the university.
This way.
It's really hard to study some title or something, one career. When you finish, like 10, you look for a job. They don't have to pay you outside the home. They don't have to pay that much. One more money. So I said, they take the risk. Go along. Try to make a better life.
Okay, that was difficult to hear, but that was when I interviewed him, he was 17 years old. His name, let's just see if his first name was Daniel. He was an unaccompanied minor who had come from Colombia, and he was basically working in fast food restaurants, trying to make some money that he could send home. And he had been in some really bad situations where he was, you know, working, he was being, you know, paid less than minimum wage. He had had a very bad kitchen cooking accident. He cut himself very badly, and his employer would not allow him to go to the doctor before he finished his shift. He was in a very vulnerable situation. Fortunately for him, he found an organization called Arise, which helps many immigrants fight basically employers who pay them sub-minimum wage. And he was able to get out of that situation and work for, you know, somebody who at least paid him what Illinois' minimum wage was. But, you know, he was like some of the other accompanied minors that I've spoken to. You know, they leave because there aren't many good opportunities. You know, many of them leave before they even finish high school because they're like, well, what am I going to do if I get a college degree? There just aren't jobs in my country. And so they come here and they get, you know, they subject themselves to a lot of, you know, difficulties. The other one that I had profiled in another story, the name he gave me was Juan Cordoba. You know, I interviewed him for a couple of hours and I still don't know what exactly happened to him at the border. Like, it was a very traumatic experience, whatever it was, and he just couldn't really talk about it. And he said that he would never, you know, recommend to anyone to make that trip. Try to wrap this up pretty quickly. I do want to sort of speak about some of the upsides that I'm seeing, though. I mean, one of the wonderful things about my work has been I get to meet the people that fight for these people. I get to meet a lot of people who encounter just the terrible bureaucracy that a lot of immigrants face when they try to get what's legal, or when they try to do things right. And I find it very inspiring because otherwise I would be kind of depressed about all the bad stories that I cover. One of the really nice ones that was fairly recent was when Obamacare was doing its enrollment just in March. There was just an army of people who were called Navigators, and their job was to help enroll as many people as they could onto the healthcare exchange. And specifically, the people that were dealing with immigrants were encountering problems with the website that went beyond just the standard problems with the website that everybody else was encountering. Issues regarding verification of identity, for example. Like, these were not issues that everybody was facing, these were issues that immigrants were facing. And so, you know, they had kind of developed their own kind of clever workarounds. You know, each team of people were, you know, they were all learning every day when they were going on to the web portal with, you know, with somebody in their office, entering their information onto the web portal. And they were sort of slowly figuring out, what are the workarounds to get me past this roadblock that I'm encountering on the website, or that one. And one of the most wonderful groups that I found that was doing this was a small team of like 4 or 5 like 20-something-year-old navigators that were all working in a small community health clinic in Wicker Park. And they were just tireless. They really like sort of had figured out a system that would be efficient with their own time and also efficient. They were very sensitive to the amount of time that it was taking their clients to, you know, take out of their work days to come down there and like explain their story all over again about their income and their health conditions and all the other information that they had to give to enroll. They were very sensitive that, you know, to the fact that for many of these people, they couldn't take a lot of time out of their workday without risking their job, you know. So they had figured out ways to sort of keep, you know, detailed portfolios for everybody. They would do the data entry after the person had left their office, and then they would just keep at it so that the next time the client came to the office, they had made some progress. They would be on the phone, like with the ACA the ACA helpline. They would be, you know, doing everything that they could to try to get people. And then on top of that, they would be blogging about it. And so that would go out and that would help other navigators that were working with similar populations to know those workarounds too. I mean, they were absolutely brilliant, and I really applauded them for what they were able to help people do. Another story that I did just a couple of weeks ago was about, it was called the Global Garden Refugee Training Farm. This is an urban garden up in the Albany Park neighborhood, a little bit west of Western.
By the rivers.
Yeah, have you seen it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really,
on our side of the street.
it's really wonderful. Yeah, it's basically like, it used to be an abandoned lot, and they got some federal funding to let refugee families who come from farming backgrounds to each have like a little plot of land to farm, which seems like it doesn't seem like it's anything that deep, but it actually has really been very important to many of these families. You know, not only can they grow vegetables to feed their family and familiar foods that, you know, may not be easy to find in American grocery markets, but it also helps with sort of the economic challenges that they face when they come here. And more importantly, they've started being able to sell some of their food, which has been good, you know, for them sort of spiritually, to like realize that they have skills that are valued by this society that they feel maybe otherwise not totally a part of. And so from like a mental health perspective, it's actually been a success, and in fact, it's been so much of a success that the governor's office is now looking at, you know, ways to replicate it in Elgin and Aurora, some of the other suburbs where, again, you know, we're seeing more and more refugees go to directly. So I know this was kind of, you know, scattershot, but and I wish that I had recorded my clips a little bit louder for you to hear, but this is just sort of a sense of like what I've been covering in my time here. How do we do the discussion?
Do we have any questions or comments? Yeah?
Oh, I had a
about the Devon area, maybe where you may want to find volunteers. If you're familiar with Devon Bank,
Yeah.
north of the Devon Avenue, there's in that bank on the second or third floor, there's like a Department of Human Resources for the Pakistanians.
Yeah.
You may want to go there and see if you can.
Yeah. That's a good idea.
To volunteer and do a story on it.
Yeah.
That's specifically for their community because they speak their native language, and a lot of people go there for like CETA services and to get signed up with like TANF and stuff like that. So you may want to.
That's a good idea. Yeah, Devon Bank is like such an amazing institution up there. I don't know how familiar you are with the story of the bank, but it's an Orthodox Jewish family. So you might know like the Westridge neighborhood is sort of a stronghold of the Orthodox Jewish community in Chicago, and the Lowndes family have had Devon Bank for several decades now, and they are themselves an institution in the Orthodox Jewish community, but they were very astute in recognizing the changes that were happening in the Devon Avenue area. And they were, I believe, the first bank, certainly in the Chicago area, to offer what's known as Sharia-compliant loans, loans for mortgages that adhere to Islamic sort of lending principles. And that has been very successful for them. And in general, the bank has been a wonderful center that has supported community growth, and they really consider it part of their mission to try to support people that are just newly adjusting to life in this country. Yeah.
I have a list of public policy questions that nobody's talking about.
Okay. I don't know if I have answers to
them. I wonder what your list is, but the impact of NAFTA, for example, which is and not really, we don't really have a very good policy with respect to economic development in places like Mexico. I mean, any person that I've talked to from there, they would say they would rather stay in Mexico, but their economy is so bad they're forced to come here. Another one, do you know Kim Bobo?
No.
She's written a book called Wage Theft, and she's with Interfaith Worker Justice, and she works mostly with the immigrant community, and that's a really big issue that you kind of mentioned that people that are working here, migrants or what have you, are their wages are not paid very fairly, and sometimes they're withheld. So I just those are some issues.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I've been sort of working for some time on a story about wage theft, and specifically looking at wage theft that happens within immigrant communities. So when it is an immigrant employer who is employing other immigrants and is breaking, federal and state law, because that clip that you all probably couldn't hear from that 17-year-old, the reason that I had interviewed him was for that story, actually, because of this wage theft issue. And one of the other clips I had brought was him kind of being indignant about, like, he was the one that brought this up. I never would, the way he put it was, I never thought that another Latin would do this to one of his own, basically. Like, yeah.
What happens to an employer when they're caught regarding wage theft? What is the penalty?
So, there is an investigation that has to be done, right? Like the state would send in investigators, and then if that person is found to have not paid fairly, they can challenge it in court, and then there's a court proceeding. And if they are found guilty, they have to pay what they didn't pay. One of the issues that I'm finding on Devon Avenue is that, I've been hearing ever since I started working here that this was a rampant problem in the restaurant industry on Devon Avenue. And so finally I'm starting to see who would talk to me about it. And the interesting thing is that, there's one particular guy that I interviewed. He's legally working here. He has legal status, and yet he's being paid the equivalent of $6.25 an hour. He's working 72 hours a week. He does the overnight shift at a very busy and popular restaurant on Devon Avenue. But he's here legally. So that was the question, is like, if you're here legally, why would you settle for that? You know, you can just go and work somewhere else. It goes back to that English language proficiency question. He's like, I can't get a job anywhere else. I don't speak English. And he doesn't have time to learn to speak English because he's working 72 hours a week. And so, yeah, I mean, this wage theft issue is a problem. But again, like, and, you know, as I've been talking to him, I've been sort of telling him that there is a process, like you can get the money you're owed if you file a complaint, but again, he's worried that he's going to lose his job, and then what's he going to be left with? Come on, yeah. Yeah.
You prompted me to think of a story about youth immigration that I heard just recently as a part of someone recounting their family lore about their grandfather who came up with Maryland. And it may say something a little different about the way communities are established now or the way things work. But the story is that his grandfather is a young person, stowaway on a ship coming to the United States. And they got in the New York harbor, and they were docking, and they were realized he wouldn't be able to get through immigration. He jumped off the ship and swam to shore. He then was walking down 7th Avenue, soaking wet, you know, with the youthful thing of just one idea at a time, like, what do I do now? And interestingly, he ran into a cousin who said, my goodness, what are you doing here? So after a little exchange, he said, well, do you want a job? And the next day he was working as a pipe fitter.
Oh, wow.
So
that is lucky.
Those kinds of, so that's part of family lore. But I think it seems to me historically, back in the much earlier waves of immigration, there were lots of young people who settled in the sense that young people are more daring and more willing to be bold, if you will, with regard to the circumstance, and then deal with issues as they unfold.
Mm-hmm.
I think now when that happens across our borders, it has often deadly results.
Mm.
But it's just an interesting take on what. I think maybe there's been a lot of youth, but maybe it's never been recorded or is accurate.
That might be it, yeah. I mean, because again, we don't, I don't, are there any estimates for, every kid that's caught in the system, how many others came over, or?
Yeah, so estimates until 2008 were about 500,000 kids were coming.
Wow.
Now detained is a different number, so it was about 8,000 in 2008. It's now estimated 120,000 this year alone, mostly from Central America. So you're seeing shifts in demographics. Mexican youth are not apprehended in the same way, so they're not being counted. So, if we have 120,000 Central American youth being apprehended and put into detention facilities, imagine the number of Mexican youth. So, I think we're starting to count since 2003, the first time we started counting. But,
yeah.
Yeah, it's not a new phenomenon.
So how do you decide on what's an interesting story for you? How do you go about your process of, imagine you talk to people and then, well, when something hits you, I mean, what is it
yeah,
about that topic?
I think it's hard to sort of say what interests, what interests me versus not what interests me, but I think I like stories that sort of show another fold to something that not everyone may be aware of. Again, like a lot of these stories that I have been reporting on, like the unaccompanied youth issue, I simply I was not aware of that before I started looking into it. And that came to me from, actually, I had met a friend that works at a center that helps these children, and we were just talking about her work, and I was like, I had no idea that was going on. I think that's a story. The first thing I did when I came here was to start making connections with all the sort of social service agencies that deal with large populations of people who don't normally have a voice, because they are the front line. Religious institutions as well, like they're very aware of what's going on in everyday people's lives. So there's never a shortage of stories, yeah.
So what do you think? I mean, this mystery that you talked about with newer Pakistani migrants, that their socioeconomic level is so low, but then no one knows about it or is talking about it. I mean,
Yeah.
what are your hypotheses, and how are you going to follow that up?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I still don't know what the deal is. You know, there are different ideas that people have sort of put forth. Some people were like, well, maybe it's like the grandparents, you know, the kids came, they were very successful, and then the grandparents came and they're living on their own somewhere or something like that. Some people said maybe all of their cousins and their family like came over and they're just reporting a household income that's like on a per capita basis looking a lot lower than what it may be if you live in the house or something like that. What else? You know, maybe it's hard. I mean, I've met a couple of people. Again, this person I told you about that worked at that Pakistani restaurant. I mean, he is classic. Like, he falls into this category. There was another fellow that I spoke with at length, but again, he did not want to be the face of this story. He was one of those stories where he and his wife came because they wanted their kids to go to good schools, and they were living in Skokie. And it was interesting because I visited them in their apartment, which was like a perfectly nice apartment. Like, you know, it was like a 2-bedroom apartment. It was, you know, well furnished, not opulent or anything, but comfortable, you know. And they were spending half of their monthly income on rent just because they wanted to be close to those schools. And so I think that, you know, there's sort of like a pressure maybe within their community to kind of keep up appearances, and that might push them to kind of living on the edge a little bit. So.
Well, you also mentioned the wars. I mean, so, the U.S. military being over in that area of the world, I don't know if policies allowing migrants or Pakistani individuals whose family been involved with the U.S. If somehow they're able to get refugee status easier, but if they're coming and they don't have the resources, but they're somehow I don't know. Something like that. I don't know if that's the case.
I don't know. I'm not aware of an influx of Pakistani
so it's
refugees.
Not an increased number, it's just the stats.
There is an increase in Pakistani immigrants, you know, like over time it's increased, but I don't think it's because they've been given refugee status. I believe it's because, you know, they're coming on their own status, or they are coming it's been interesting to cover the Asian American community because, you know, many of them, when they came over here, had status at least at the beginning, and some of them continue to have status, but many of them came like as a tourist or whatever, and then they'll like overstay, and you know, so yeah.
What is the current policy right now for immigration? Right? Who sets the rules? Which countries get in the lottery? How many from each country?
It's a real mess. It's a real mess.
In the strategy, so we just decide we're going to open up borders to a certain country, but there's no planning here for it, right?
Well, so, you know, some of it is diversity based, but that's actually a very small number. Like the number of visas that are granted to, like, that are allocated according to countries, for example, that you don't normally meet immigrants from those countries. It's kind of rare to meet immigrants from those countries. Those diversity visas are fairly limited in number. I don't know the exact way that they calculate, like, you know, this country is going to get this many and that country is going to get that many, but it's compared to the overall immigration picture, it's kind of negligible. And then you've got people that come, and you've got like a whole variety of different kinds of visas, right? Like you've got people who come on different classifications of family visas, right? Because they have a relative, they have a daughter or a mother or a sister or a brother that's here, right? So they're, you know, those people that are in the U.S. are able to apply for status for the, you know, they're able to apply for visas for their family members abroad to come. You've got a lot of people that come with like sort of temporary job sort of statuses. So like an H-1B visa is like for a highly skilled, computer programmer, for example, like people who have a certain amount of education in a specific kind of field, like in the STEM fields. They're able to come temporarily, and then often they'll try to see if while they're here they can start the application for a green card and gain status that way. It's a real confusing system. That's why they're talking about immigration reform, right? Because there's every which way. People who come, some of these children that come, by themselves, some of them end up getting to stay legally, either temporarily or permanently, depending on what happened to them. Or, did they report a crime? Did they, if they did, then maybe they're eligible for one type of visa. Were they abused? Were they sex trafficked? That actually could qualify them for a different kind of visa. So I don't know if that's a good answer, but there's
and I think too, just in terms of the refugee population, if you have a war, a conflict, people are displaced outside of their country. The UN has UN refugee camps. The US says we're going to take X number of refugees from X number of countries and resettle them in Fargo and Nashville and Chicago and Lansing, and it's actually been used as a population strategy in many ways, where communities that need laborers that need population, so you can resettle Somali.
Yeah, that's why you get like a random like Somali population in like Minnesota or whatever, or like Hmong people in like somewhere in the Midwest, and it's kind of like, why are they there? Well, they're there because of that.
But the numbers of refugees that are resettled has decreased dramatically since September 11th.
Well, it's gone back up. Yeah, it's gone back up since then. So, yeah.
I was stunned to find out a while back on the other end of the socioeconomic spectrum that we now sell visas, and that people who are actually citizenship, if I understand it correctly, people who are willing to invest a certain amount of money and create some job in some community that needs it, it'll employ a certain number of people, can purchase citizenship.
Yeah.
So people are doing it for themselves and their families.
Yeah.
Presumably retaining citizenship from where they are, but adding the U.S. to it.
Yeah.
I was sort of stunned.
It's interesting. I did a story about one of my sort of unrealized dreams was to do, like, when immigration was like really hot, I guess at the beginning of last summer, was to do like one story about immigration from each of like the different Asian populations to get at like what their unique stories were. And so the story that I did about the Korean population was that many of them, they're not like rich, like they're not, outright able to buy something, but they were coming on these visas called E2 visas, which were temporary, and which allowed them to stay here for a certain number of years if they started a business and, invested a certain amount of money in keeping that business alive. And many of them would do this and concurrently be waiting for their green card application or their, permanent residency application to work its way through the system, so that by the end, they achieve status, their kids have had continuity in the schools here, and, hopefully, but the thing is that it doesn't always work out. And what you see sometimes is people that have invested their life savings from Korea, like they sold their family's home, like all their property, and they've invested like hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars in the U.S. economy, and then it just doesn't work out. And so it's a crazy system. Yeah.
Are you familiar with Asian Human Services there on Houston?
Yeah. Yeah.
We're affiliated with the charter school that my daughter used to go to. It's actually part of Passages Charter School.
Yeah, is that on Bryn Mawr?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
That's
so,
right.
You see a lot of influx of different nationalities coming through them into the school and then into the neighborhood there in that way also, which was very interesting. My daughter got to meet a lot of the refugee children. One in particular, he saw his mom killed in Cold War. He couldn't really speak English very well when he arrived here, but he could speak 3 different languages fluently. And so it was a good learning experience for my daughter as well as the other children to encounter these children and try to help them socialize into their new environment.
Yeah.
So that service in itself is doing a good deed in the community.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, one of the things that I've heard over and over again is sort of how it tends to be easier for the children to kind of assimilate, or to, they learn English quickly when they're young and stuff like that. And then it kind of, in some cultures, can upend like the social system that households have, where, if they come from a culture where seniority is like if you're older, you have seniority in the family in terms of deciding what happens, everybody listens to you, that kind of thing. But then, in cases where the children are learning English and the older ones are not, you kind of reverse the power structure where like the parents and the grandparents often have to rely on the kids to like help them, go to the hospital if they need to, so that they can translate and stuff like that. So.
And that becomes a problem in healthcare. I'm in the healthcare field, especially when parents, especially older parents, don't speak English and they have cancer or some terminally ill disease. The family doesn't fully translate
right.
what's actually.
Yeah, you need to know the terminology. Yeah.
So what they're doing
right.
is they're mandating that the translator, so that they know that the person is getting full communication on what's going on to them.
Yeah.
Due to a lot of different religious beliefs and other beliefs and language barriers, it could be a big problem, and also HIPAA too.
Yeah.
So we see that a lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you've mentioned religious organizations, social service organizations is playing this kind of critical role in different communities. Communities themselves in Chinatown are organizing very savvy political force. Banks up on Devon. What about the city of Chicago? What about, have any of your stories brought you to, public policy, to, the seat of government, city government?
Yeah. So under Mayor Emanuel, they opened this office called the Office of New Americans, which was supposed to kind of make it easier, especially if you're an immigrant that wants to start a small business, to be able to get like the language access resources that you need, and to be able to understand like how would you do that. I don't know how well they're doing. There's a lot of stuff going on like that may not even be directly related to immigration, but that does affect immigrants. One of the stories that I've been covering is the taxi industry. I've been doing a lot of coverage of the taxi industry because a lot of the taxi driving population is immigrants, and a lot of them live on the north side. What we're seeing now is that there's been sort of this influx of technology apps that are coming from Silicon Valley that kind of change the way that the taxi industry works. They let pretty much you or me or anyone with a car, if you may have heard of Uber or Lyft or Sidecar, they let anyone kind of use their car essentially like a taxi, and this has made it quite difficult for some taxi drivers to stay in that business, because why pay a $700 a week lease for your car when you can just for your taxi, when you could just use your own car, right? And so the city of Chicago is looking at basically legalizing these rideshare services with some regulations, but if that happens, a lot of people are, that's not an immigration policy, but that's a policy that really affects an industry that a lot of immigrants work in. And it doesn't seem like there's been much communication among all the offices in City Hall that might have some insight into that, about what that really means. So, yeah.
It could be very positive for these drivers because they could shed all that middleman price.
And some of them have taken advantage of it. Yeah,
Right.
some of them have.
It's expensive to own a taxi, and to own that medallion, it's thousands of dollars.
Yeah, it's.
And they're limited.
If the thing is, so you could, if you own the medallion, right? You've invested depending on when you bought it, let's say you bought it in the last 2 years, right? You've invested the equivalent of a house, right? You have basically a house mortgage. You bought a $350,000 piece of metal to like stick on your car, right? And that gives you the license to pick up people off the street and stuff like that. For many immigrants, and I spent a full day with one just last week actually, that was their retirement plan. They were going to sell it. You cannot sell a medallion today. Like, if you try to sell one, nobody will buy it from you because it's unclear what the value of it is, given that these other things are going to be likely legalized in some way. So if you own a medallion, you're kind of like hard out on your luck. But you're right. If you're leasing your cab, like, yeah, it might actually be better for you to just get out of the taxi industry and just hop over to driving a rideshare vehicle.
Are there a lot of individuals with medallions, or are they mostly owned by cab companies?
I think about, don't quote me on this, but I feel like about half of the medallions in Chicago are independently owned and operated. Yeah.
I wanted to say that regarding the taxi industry, having to come from Nigeria, I know a lot of people that are in that industry, but they have changed the policy lately and made the licensing to obtain the insurance license is very difficult now, and they're really some of them out. I know a lot of them that couldn't pass the change to pay a lot of money and failed and failed.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
So it actually might be better for those guys if they could drive for Uber or Lyft or Sidecar, right? Because you don't really have to take you don't have to take a language proficiency test for that, or
You just have to pass like a background test and like a background criminal history.
yeah, like they've got their own application
Right, for
process.
that.
So, yeah.
What about the schools? So you have this incredible diversity in some of the schools on the north side, which is wonderful in so many ways. But then with the language difficulties and, I mean, my understanding from just my son's experiences, I mean, there's an incredible amount of tolerance, people getting along with each other, and then, but, you know, I have also heard of a lot of some Muslim American prejudice and have you heard anything in the schools?
You know,
about any part of
I don't know. Yeah, I
Yeah.
have not really done much education coverage, mostly because we've got a couple of really fantastic education reporters at my station. I have visited some schools, though, and it's really remarkable what they are working with. You know, that some schools have 60 to 90 different languages that are spoken in their school hallways, and it's quite remarkable. Is there a question back there? Yeah.
Yes, I'm really interested in the health status of the populations that you've been working with. If any of your work has touched on that at all. I know you mentioned the case of Danielle in the workplace. I'm less familiar with the health status of newly arriving Asian American immigrants, much more so with Latino immigrants. The Latino paradox, where the immigrants coming here are much healthier even than the general population. And after being here for a while, becoming acculturated, and they lose the protective factors associated with the Latino paradox. I was wondering if there was anything similar with Asian American immigrants, and also access to healthcare types of issues. I represent a nonprofit organization that serves as a safety net for individuals 300% below the poverty level, regardless of immigration status. So, you know, whether they're newly arriving, whether they've been here, you know, not quite 5 years, and so they can't avail themselves of public benefits, or, you know, what have you. So just being able to get that information out to the people that need it, so sort of overall health question.
Yeah. I'm trying to think if I've done anything really specifically about health. I know that one of the issues that some of the Asian sort of organizing groups have been trying to focus city and state attention on has been hepatitis screenings, particularly for the East Asian communities, because apparently there are high rates of hepatitis, and this can lead to liver cancers, I believe, and some other health issues. And so they've been basically dealing not just, so there's sort of an educational outreach issue, but also sort of like a reticence that I've been told about culturally to seeing doctors. And so they've really been working kind of hard. I think one of the one of the other issues is that for some of the Asian populations, like they may have once been like really concentrated geographically in one part of the city or the suburbs, but like as people, as cultures are here longer, they disperse. More people, they move out into the suburbs or they move to other parts of the city. So I think one of the reasons that Chinatown has had the success that they've had is that they've maintained a very densely populated area of the city, and they are able to do outreach much more effectively than some of the other populations. One of the nice things about the North Side is that, especially compared to the West Side and the South Side, I mean, there is a lot of there are just a lot of service agencies. Asian Human Services, as you mentioned, they've got multiple locations on the North Side. All of these refugee agencies are located on the North Side. On Devon Avenue itself, I mean, there's like a whole bunch of medical clinics. There's another, there's the Humdard Center, which also does these things. And so I think, it's quite lucky, actually, if you're able to get to these places on the North Side because there are many options. But, I did do a story early in my time here about mental health resources, particularly for refugees. This was around the time that World Relief, which is one of these refugee resettlement agencies, closed its mental health clinic, and I believe that left maybe like only one other for refugees in the city. At a time that, again, we had made this transition from having people who were coming for political reasons to having people who are coming from like truly traumatic, situations. And so, I believe there continues to be a dearth of mental health resources for some immigrants, but they're also at this, flip side of that coin, there's also in some of these cultures sort of a stigma attached to getting help for mental health.
Exactly. Just as you mentioned, regarding having so many options or resources for clinics or social service programs on the north side of Chicago, my program Access to Care actually serves the northwest side of Chicago and suburban Cook County, because in those areas you can't find clinics or social service agencies that are really able to facilitate the access the way that you do have concentrated in on the north side of Chicago.
Yeah. That's, this has been one of these issues that many of the social service agencies are reckoning with, is like, now that more immigrants and refugees are moving directly to the suburbs, should we locate out there? If you do that, where? I mean, the suburbs, that's a big area, right? Like, should we go to Lombard? If we go to Lombard, like, maybe people in some other faraway suburb can't get to us. And so it's a difficult calculation that many of them are having to make.
Any final questions? Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.